The morning sun cast long shadows across the asphalt as Kendrick Robinson pulled into the parking lot outside the Greenville Municipal Courthouse. It was 8:42 a.m., and though the sky was clear, a heavy sense of urgency pressed down on him. Kendrick exhaled sharply, gripping the steering wheel for a moment before stepping out of the car. He hated being late. It was something he had spent his entire career avoiding, something that went against his very nature. As a federal prosecutor, discipline and preparedness were second nature to him. But today, the universe seemed determined to test him. This morning should have been simple, nothing more than a routine visit to dispute an error in a property tax adjustment. The city had inexplicably increased the taxes on the house his grandmother had left him, despite no changes in ownership or valuation. He had spent weeks gathering evidence, poring over old records, and compiling documentation to prove the mistake. The house wasn't just a property. It was a piece of his childhood, a place filled with memories of his grandmother's warm voice guiding him through life's lessons, of Sunday afternoons spent on the porch listening to her stories about perseverance and integrity. And yet, despite his careful planning, life had thrown a wrench in his schedule. Just as he had been preparing to leave for court that morning, his phone had buzzed with an urgent call from his team at the U.S. Attorney's Office. A human trafficking case he had been working on had taken a sudden turn. The defense team had filed a last-minute motion, one that could potentially jeopardize months of painstaking investigation. Kendrick couldn't ignore it. Lives were at stake. For 30 crucial minutes, he had gone through the motion, analyzing the defense's argument, dictating an immediate response, and making sure his team had everything they needed to counter the move. By the time he was able to grab his briefcase and rush out the door, he was already cutting it dangerously close. As he approached the courthouse steps, his phone buzzed again. A message from his assistant: "The judge in Greenville has a reputation for being tough on latecomers. Be careful." Kendrick sighed, tucking his phone into his briefcase. He wasn't worried. He had facts on his side. He had evidence. And more than anything, he had the truth. Still, something about that message lingered in his mind, a quiet warning he couldn't quite shake. With a deep breath, he straightened his tie, squared his shoulders, and stepped into the courthouse, unaware that this seemingly routine morning was about to change everything. The courthouse smelled of old paper and stale coffee, its beige walls dulled by years of wear. It was nothing like the federal courthouses Kendrick was accustomed to. No polished wood paneling, no grand architecture, no hushed sense of reverence that came with high-profile cases. This was a different world, one where the stakes were smaller on paper, but just as monumental for the people sitting anxiously in the waiting area. Men and women clutched folders of documents, whispering to one another, their faces tense with worry. Some were here to dispute parking tickets, others to contest fines or minor infractions. To Kendrick, these were simple matters, but for them, each decision made in this courtroom could affect their ability to pay rent, keep their jobs, or avoid a mark on their record. He knew that justice was just as important here as it was in the halls of the federal courts. Kendrick checked his watch. 8:50 morgens 10 minutes to spare. He exhaled slowly, adjusting his tie as he made his way down a narrow hallway. The doors to the various courtrooms were marked with brass plaques, some polished, others faded with time. He stopped in front of room 204. Judge Charles Whitman. The name wasn't familiar to him, but something about it felt heavy. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The courtroom was already filling with people. The seats were worn from years of use, the air thick with anticipation. Kendrick found a place near the back, setting his briefcase on his lap as he flipped through his folder one last time. The documents were all in order. He had everything he needed to prove his case. Then the door at the front of the room opened, and Judge Charles Whitman entered. A tall man with neatly combed silver hair and piercing blue eyes, he carried himself with the confidence of someone used to absolute authority. His expression was unreadable, his gaze sweeping across the room as if memorizing each face before him. He didn't need to speak to command attention. The way people straightened in their seats, the way the room fell into instant silence said enough. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Kendrick stood along with the others, his posture straight, his expression neutral. He had seen plenty of judges like Whitman before, stern, no-nonsense, efficient. But there was something else in the way he held himself, something Kendrick couldn't quite name yet. The judge wasted no time, calling cases one by one, dispensing decisions with mechanical precision. He was brisk, detached, moving through the docket like a machine. Kendrick watched carefully. A middle-aged man in a suit arrived late, slipping into a seat near the side of the room. The judge didn't acknowledge him. A few minutes later, a young woman in casual clothes hurried in, head down, settling quietly into a chair. Again, no reaction. But when Kendrick's name was called, everything changed. He rose, gathering his documents, and strode toward the podium with steady confidence. As he approached, Judge Whitman's eyes locked onto him, and in that instant, Kendrick sensed the shift. The room, the energy, the scrutiny. It was subtle, but unmistakable. "You're late, Mr. Robinson," the judge said, his voice sharper than it had been for any of the previous cases. "Do you think the court's time is less valuable than your own?" Kendrick maintained his composure, raising a hand slightly in a gesture of acknowledgement. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was attending to urgent federal matters." The judge cut him off. "Excuses don't excuse tardiness," he said, his voice slicing through the room. "This court operates on order and respect. If you can't follow that, I suggest you re-evaluate your priorities." Kendrick felt the weight of the courtroom's eyes on him, but he didn't flinch. He had spent years in high-stakes legal battles, standing before some of the most formidable judges in the country. He wasn't rattled easily. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of timeliness," he said, his tone steady. "If I may, I'd like to present my case regarding the property tax adjustment." The judge waved a dismissive hand. "We'll get to that. First, there's the matter of contempt." Kendrick's jaw tightened, though his expression remained neutral. "Tardiness undermines the integrity of these proceedings," the judge continued. "You are hereby fined $750. The words landed like a hammer. For the first time since stepping into the courtroom, Kendrick felt a flicker of shock. $750 for being a few minutes late? In a municipal court, where fines were typically reserved for serious infractions. Murmurs rippelt trug the room. Even those who had no stake in the matter seemed taken aback. Kendrick took a measured breath. He had two choices: argue now in the heat of the moment, or take a step back and assess the bigger picture. He chose the latter. "Your Honor," he began, keeping his voice calm, "may I explain?" The judge raised his gavel. "You may not," he said coldly. "Consider this a lesson in respecting the court." Kendrick said nothing, but his mind was already working. He turned his head slightly, scanning the room. The man in the suit who had arrived late was still seated, untouched. The young woman who had slipped in earlier was scrolling on her phone, unconcerned. None of them had been reprimanded. None of them had been fined. The realization settled in his chest. This wasn't about tardiness. It was about something else entirely. Kendrick returned to his seat, his mind a whirlwind of calculations and observations. He had argued in countless courtrooms, faced difficult judges before, but something about this moment felt different. It wasn't just the fine, it was the way the judge had singled him out, the way the room had shifted the moment he stood. He had sensed it immediately, but now, he was determined to confirm it. He picked up his pen and quietly began to write, his gaze flickering up now and then as Judge Whitman continued calling cases. One by one, defendants stepped forward. He paid attention to each late arrival. The man in the gray suit who had come in after proceedings began presented his case without so much as a mention of tardiness. The young woman who had scrolled through her phone after entering late was dismissed without issue. Not once did Whitman reprimand them. Not once did he mention contempt. Kendrick's grip tightened around his pen. The pattern was clear. The fine had never been about tardiness. It had been about him. By the time the session neared its end, Kendrick had documented every discrepancy, every unfair ruling, every unspoken cue that hinted at something deeper. He watched as the last case concluded and people began to gather their things. Then, while others were heading for the door, Kendrick stood. He walked purposefully to the front of the courtroom, stopping just a few feet from the judge's bench. The remaining few in the audience hesitated, sensing that something unexpected was about to unfold. The court clerk's fingers, which had been flying over the keyboard, slowed. The bailiff shifted slightly. Judge Whitman looked up, irritated. "Mr. Robinson, this session is concluded. If you have further business, you'll need to schedule an appointment." Kendrick reached into his jacket and withdrew his badge, placing it firmly on the podium where everyone could see. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I believe it's important to formally introduce myself." His voice was calm, measured. but carried an unmistakable weight. I'm Kendrick Robinson, Assistant United States Attorney for the Northern District of South Carolina. I've spent over a decade handling cases involving human trafficking, corruption, and civil rights violations. The shift in the room was immediate. The air grew thick with unspoken tension. The court clerk glanced between Kendrick and the judge, her fingers now hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. The few remaining spectators leaned in ever so slightly, sensing that something very important was happening. The reaction Kendrick was most interested in, however, was the one before him. Judge Whitman's hands, which had been resting on a stack of documents, stilled. His jaw tightened. For the first time that morning, there was a flicker of something beneath his otherwise controlled expression. Kendrick let the silence settle before continuing. "I was late this morning," he said, voice steady, "because of an urgent federal case requiring my immediate attention. And while I understand the importance of courtroom procedures, I couldn't help but notice the disparity in how cases were handled here today." Whitman's lips pressed into a thin line. "Mr. Robinson, if you feel there was a procedural issue, you are welcome to file a formal complaint through the appropriate channels." Kendrick tilted his head slightly, unfazed. "I already have," he said, holding up his notebook. "Not just regarding my own case, but about the differing treatment of other latecomers, particularly along racial lines." A murmur rippled through the room. The court clerk blinked rapidly, as if deciding whether or not to keep typing. The bailiff, a man who had spent years enforcing order in this very room, watched the exchange with careful neutrality. Whitman leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, but Kendrick could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers gripped the armrests just a little too tightly. "Are you accusing this court of misconduct?" the judge asked, his voice lower now. Kendrick didn't hesitate. "I'm stating what I observed, Your Honor," he said. "And as a federal prosecutor, it's my duty to ensure that justice is applied equally, regardless of who stands before the bench." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time since Kendrick had entered this room, the judge seemed at a loss for words. The court clerk's hands twitched, as if resisting the urge to take notes on a moment that had undoubtedly never happened in this courtroom before. In the back row, a young law student, who had been quietly observing all morning, scribbled furiously in her notebook, her eyes wide with fascination. Judge Whitman cleared his throat. "This court takes such matters seriously. If you believe there was an error in judgment, you know the proper channels to pursue." Kendrick placed his badge and identification back into his pocket. "I intend to," he said simply. "But I also believe this moment presents an opportunity for reflection on how we ensure fairness and equality in every courtroom." The judge's nostrils flared ever so slightly. He had presided over this court for decades. His authority was rarely questioned, let alone in front of an audience. And yet, here he was being challenged, not by an angry defendant, not by a public defender, but by a federal prosecutor. Whitman adjusted the papers in front of him, regaining his composure. "You may go, Mr. Robinson." Kendrick didn't move immediately. He let the moment settle, let the weight of his words linger before he inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. "Thank you, Your Honor." Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit. The remaining spectators followed him with their eyes, some exchanging quiet, knowing glances. An older black man, sitting 2 rows ahead, turned ever so slightly as Kendrick passed, offering a small nod, one that spoke volumes. The young law student, still furiously jotting notes, barely looked up, but Kendrick could feel the energy in the room shifting. He stepped out into the hallway, the heavy wooden doors swinging shut behind him. The air outside the courtroom felt sharper, clearer, as if the atmosphere had changed just a little in his wake. He had made his move. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Kendrick stepped into his car, the courthouse still looming behind him. He sat for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his mind racing through everything that had transpired in that courtroom. The fine, the dismissive tone, the blatant inequality, none of it had been subtle. It had been deliberate, calculated, executed under the assumption that no one would question it. But Kendrick wasn't just anyone. He pulled out his phone and began typing. The email was addressed to Julia Harper, his supervisor at the U.S. Attorney's Office. It was precise, detailed, laying out everything he had witnessed. The discrepancies. The selective punishments. The fact that Judge Whitman had fined him $750 for being a few minutes late while allowing white defendants to enter the courtroom unnoticed. He hit send. Within minutes, a response came through. "We need to talk."
Call me now.
Kendrick dialed, barely waiting for Julia to pick up. She got straight to the point. One was watching, before slipping him a small, leather-bound notebook. "I wrote down every time something didn't sit right," she whispered. "Every case where the rulings didn't match. I thought one day, someone might need to see it." Kendrick flipped through the pages that night, his heart pounding as he read. Names. Dates. Incidents of blatant judicial bias. Fines that had been excessive for black defendants, but waived for white ones. Statements from the judge that dripped with subtle but undeniable prejudice. It was all there, years of injustice, meticulously recorded. And Mrs. Thompson wasn't the only one who had seen it. James Wilson, the court bailiff, had served in that courtroom for over 15 years. When Kendrick approached him, he was reluctant at first, wary of speaking out against a sitting judge. But after a long pause, he finally exhaled and met Kendrick's gaze. "I've seen it for years," Wilson admitted. "Watched people come through that door, hoping for fairness. And I've watched them walk out with nothing but fines they couldn't afford and sentences they didn't deserve." He sighed. "I always knew it wasn't right. But I never thought anyone would do something about it." The case was building itself. Then a law student, one who had been in the courtroom, "I read your report," she said, her voice sharp with urgency. "If what you're describing is accurate, this isn't just about one bad judge. This could be a systemic issue." "I believe it is," Kendrick replied. "And I intend to prove it." The next morning, Kendrick began digging. He started with public court records, cases from the last 5 years in Whitman's courtroom. The numbers spoke for themselves. Black defendants were fined an average of 3 times more than their white counterparts for the same infractions. Late arrivals by white defendants were routinely ignored, while black defendants were reprimanded or hit with steep fines. Even requests for leniency, payment plans, reduced penalties, were disproportionately denied to minorities. The pattern wasn't just troubling. It was damning. But Kendrick knew numbers alone wouldn't be enough. He needed first-hand accounts. He needed witnesses. The breakthrough came when Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, stopped him outside the courthouse one evening. She was in her 60s, a woman who had worked under Whitman for years, her experience evident in the quiet, knowing way she looked at Kendrick before speaking. "I've been keeping notes," she said in a low voice. "For a long time now." She hesitated, glancing around, as if ensuring Nth that morning, posted an account of what she had seen. Within hours, it went viral. Her post detailed the entire exchange, how Kendrick had been singled out while white defendants had been ignored. She described the tension in the room, the way even those watching had felt the weight of what was happening but had stayed silent. People began sharing their own experiences. "I was fined $500 for a parking ticket when the white guy before me just got a warning. Whitman humiliated my father in court, made comments about his lack of discipline, while letting a white teenager walk out with no penalty. I stopped contesting fines in that courtroom years ago. No point. The system is rigged." The media caught wind of it. Headlines emerged. Bias in the courtroom? Federal prosecutor challenges judge's conduct. Is justice really blind?
A Municipalcourt unter Feier.
What had started as one fine, one moment of injustice, was now a full-blown scandal. The Judicial Review Commission announced a formal investigation into Judge Whitman's rulings. News outlets demanded records. Local officials were forced to comment. And Kendrick knew this was only the beginning. The walls around Judge Whitman were beginning to close in. What had started as a single fine, a moment he likely believed would pass unnoticed, had erupted into something far greater. The Judicial Review Commission had launched a formal investigation, digging into years of case records from his courtroom. Kendrick's findings, combined with the detailed notes from Mrs. Thompson and the testimony from James Wilson, painted a picture too stark to ignore. And then there were the numbers. Local news stations ran headline after headline, exposing the shocking disparities in Whitman's rulings. Court documents showed that black defendants were fined, on average, 3 times more than white defendants for the same offenses. White defendants arriving late had routinely been allowed to proceed without consequence. while black defendants were reprimanded, humiliated, and financially penalized. The evidence wasn't circumstantial, it was systemic. At first, Whitman tried to brush it off. In a brief statement to the press, he dismissed the allegations as misinterpretations of judicial discretion. He insisted that he had always ruled fairly, that any disparities were coincidental, that he had merely upheld the law as he saw fit. But the public wasn't buying it. The outrage grew louder. Citizens of Greenville, people who had quietly endured injustice for years, finally found their voices. Protests erupted outside the courthouse. Crowds gathered with signs that read "Justice should be blind," and "No more bias in our courts." Some came forward with their own stories, people who had never spoken up before, out of fear that no one would believe them. A single mother told reporters how she had been fined $500 for contesting an unfair property violation, while a white homeowner in the same situation had his case dismissed without a fee. A young black man described how Whitman had berated him for being irresponsible over a minor infraction, yet had treated a white defendant in a nearly identical case with patience and understanding. Each story added another crack to the facade of authority Whitman had carefully built over decades. Inside the courthouse, pressure mounted. The Judicial Review Commission subpoenaed years of financial records, examining whether these excessive fines had disproportionately funded city programs, something that could escalate into a corruption investigation. The Oversight Committee interviewed court employees, some of whom, now emboldened by the growing movement, admitted that they had long suspected bias but had felt powerless to challenge it. Behind closed doors, Whitman's allies in the legal community began to distance themselves. Judges, attorneys, and officials who once spoke highly of him now refused to comment. No one wanted to be caught defending a man who had suddenly become the face of judicial discrimination. And then came the breaking point. A whistleblower, an assistant clerk who had worked under Whitman for years, leaked internal emails showing that the judge had, on multiple occasions, made disparaging remarks about certain types of people who came into his courtroom. Within hours, the story exploded. National media picked it up. Civil rights organizations called for his immediate resignation. Legal analysts debated whether this case was a violation of federal anti-discrimination laws. By the time Whitman appeared in front of the Judicial Review Commission for questioning, he was a man already defeated. The once commanding presence, the judge who could silence a room with a single glare, now looked visibly aged. His responses were carefully worded, but empty. He denied intentional bias, but he couldn't explain the numbers. He refused to acknowledge discrimination, but he couldn't refute the testimony. He was, in every sense, cornered. 2 days later, a statement was released. Effective immediately, Judge Charles Whitman will be stepping down from his position. He believes this is in the best interest of the court and the community. There was no apology, no admission of guilt, just a quiet, unceremonious exit. For Kendrick, it wasn't a victory to celebrate, it was simply a necessary step toward something greater. The resignation of one judge wouldn't erase the years of damage done. It wouldn't fix the system overnight. But it was proof that change was possible. Outside the courthouse, the protests continued, but now they were filled with something new. Hope. The courthouse in Greenville was no longer the same place Kendrick had walked into that fateful morning. The old beige walls had been repainted, the waiting areas reorganized, and a new welcome desk now greeted visitors as they entered, offering guidance, legal aid information, and resources that had never been made available before. But the real changes weren't in the decor. After Whitman's resignation, a new judge was appointed, one with a reputation for fairness and impartiality. More importantly, systemic reforms had begun taking shape. No longer could fines and penalties be issued without proper oversight. The numbers would be audited, reviewed for racial and socio-economic disparities. Judges, clerks, and court officers were now required to undergo mandatory bias training, learning how discrimination, even when unintentional, could seep into the justice system. Kendrick had been invited back to the courthouse, not as a defendant, not as an observer, but as a speaker. A group of local judges, lawyers, and law students had gathered to discuss the policy changes being implemented. As he stood at the back of the courtroom, watching the proceedings, he felt something unfamiliar. A sense of progress. The ripple effect stretched beyond Greenville. Across South Carolina, municipal courts were now under review. Judicial oversight committees had expanded their reach, investigating patterns of sentencing and fine distributions. Community organizations had stepped forward, demanding permanent changes to prevent this kind of bias from happening again. And it didn't stop there. In Washington, legal scholars began discussing Kendrick's case as a landmark example of how institutional bias could be challenged. Federal prosecutors from other districts reached out, asking for guidance on how to initiate similar investigations in their own jurisdictions. Civil rights groups used his findings to push for broader reforms, calling for transparency in sentencing data nationwide. The impact wasn't just professional. It was personal. One afternoon, as Kendrick left the courthouse after another policy meeting, an elderly black man approached him. He walked slowly, his hands weathered with age, his eyes filled with something deeper than gratitude. "I've been coming here for 40 years, the man said, his voice heavy with memory. "Seen a lot of men like Whitman sit in that chair. And for 40 years, I never thought I'd see the day someone like you stood up to it." He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "Thank you for giving us hope." Kendrick wasn't sure what to say at first. He had never done this for recognition. He had done it because it needed to be done. But standing there, looking at a man who had spent his life watching injustice go unchallenged, he realized something. Hope wasn't just about believing things could change. It was about proving they could. A few weeks later, he was invited to speak at a law school, where students had started a civil rights legal clinic inspired by his case. After his speech, a young woman approached him, clutching a notebook filled with ideas. "You've made me believe that the law isn't just about rules," she said. "It's about people."
You have given me a reason to fight for justice.
Kendrick smiled, humbled by the words. "The fight is just beginning," he told her. "But if we all do our part, we can make the system better." The changes weren't without resistance. Some judges and attorneys bristled at the new oversight measures, claiming they undermined their authority. But the numbers didn't lie. Within a year, racial disparities in sentencing had dropped significantly in Greenville's municipal courts. Defendants who once felt helpless now had access to legal aid and fair representation. For Kendrick, the most powerful moments weren't in headlines or policy meetings. They were in the small, quiet exchanges, the moments where justice finally felt real. One morning, he received a letter from a young public defender in Chicago. She had read about his case and had started her own investigation into biases in her city's courts. The letter ended with a single sentence. "Your stand reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place." Kendrick read it twice before placing it in a folder labeled Impact. He leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of it settle. This fight had never been about him. It had always been about something bigger, the countless voices that had been silenced, ignored, or dismissed for too long. But now, those voices were being heard. Months later, Kendrick walked back into the courthouse where it had all begun. He wasn't there for a case or an investigation. He had been invited to speak at the unveiling of a new judicial ethics center, named in part after his efforts. As he stepped to the podium, he looked out at the crowd. Judges, lawyers, clerks, law students, and community members filled the room. Their faces were a mix of anticipation and gratitude. Kendrick took a breath. "Justice isn't just about laws," he said. "It's about how we treat the people who come into our courtrooms. It's about fairness, dignity, and respect. And it's about ensuring that every person, no matter who they are, knows that they matter." The applause was thunderous. But Kendrick wasn't focused on the noise. He was focused on the faces, the ones that believed in change because they had seen it happen. And he knew that while the work was far from over, this was a step in the right direction. The courthouse stood quiet in the early morning light, its once faded walls now freshly painted, its entrance no longer an unwelcoming threshold for those who feared what might happen inside. Kendrick walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing against the polished floors. He paused at the newly installed plaque mounted near the front entrance. The engraved letters were bold, unwavering in their message. Justice must be fair for all. He reached out, running his fingers lightly over the words. It wasn't just a slogan. It was a promise, one that had come at a cost, one that had required voices to be raised, risks to be taken, and an entire community to refuse silence. For years, people had walked into this courthouse knowing the odds were stacked against them. They had come seeking fairness but left with nothing but penalties they didn't deserve. Now, things were different. The change wasn't just in the leadership or the policies. It was in the very air of the place. He could see it in the way the clerks interacted with the people in line, offering guidance instead of cold indifference. He could see it in the new resources made available. Posters on the walls explaining legal rights, a help desk that didn't exist before, and the quiet confidence on the faces of those waiting for their turn. Outside, the city carried on as usual. Cars passed by, pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks, and life continued. But Kendrick knew that somewhere in this town, maybe in a quiet neighborhood, maybe in a busy office, there was someone who would no longer have to fear walking into this building. Someone who would finally have a fair chance. As he stepped outside, the crisp air filled his lungs, and he exhaled slowly. The fight wasn't over. There would always be another battle, another courtroom, another system that needed to be held accountable. But today this fight, this moment, had been won. He glanced back at the courthouse one last time, the plaque catching the morning light. Then, without hesitation, Kendrick walked forward, knowing that the pursuit of justice never truly ends. Justice is not something that is given, it must be protected. If you see injustice, speak up, because change only happens when someone dares to stand up. If this story made you think, don't just scroll away, take action. Like this video to help spread awareness. Share it with your friends and family, because conversations spark change. Comment below and tell us your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed an abuse of power?
Let's talk about it.
Follow our channel for more powerful real-life stories. And turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Change starts with awareness. Awareness starts with you. Be part of the movement.